Stories go on forever, but in a book, they must end. The last page eventually comes, where we bid goodbye to the characters and their journeys. This is what I felt when I was reading Janice Pariat's latest novel, Everything the Light Touches. Janice is the author of Boats on Land, a collection of short stories, the novels Seahorse and The Nine-Chambered Heart. Her novel, Everything the Light Touches, was published in October 2022 and was included in the New Yorker's list of best books of 2022. Currently, she teaches creative writing and art history at Ashoka University. Janice joins this episode to talk about the craft behind her book, Everything the Light Touches. We talk about her inspirations, research process, and how she came up with her characters that span across time and continent. Thank you for tuning in to How'd You Create That? The podcast is supported by the Open Institute for Social Science. You can listen to us on YouTube, YouTube Music, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast platforms. Subscribe and follow us to find more episodes on the creative process. I'm your host, Alpha. Thank you so much for, agreeing to do this. It's so lovely to see you. I mean, I still remember meeting you at the Nepal Literature Festival, like your session with Pratibha, and it was so wonderful.
Well, it's lovely to reconnect now, and I'm sitting here and thinking of our really wonderful time in Pokhara at the Lit Fest and meeting you there. True. It's so wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Thank you so much. And your book just won the Paper and Pen Awards.
It did.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you. It was a lovely surprise because I was informed that it was on the short list, and I thought, okay, that's lovely news. That's good news. And then, this was a lovely way to, a lovely bit of news to come home to.
Indeed. I took my sweet time with the book, and something that I did with the book was, so we have, I sometimes have to travel inside the city, and I like using the bus, and I like using Saza bus, which is one of our public transportations, one of those big buses, big green buses. And I read so many parts of the book on the road when I had to go from one point of the city to the other point of the city, and I think that was such a lovely experience for me, especially I think I read a lot of Evie's part on the bus.
Yeah.
And then she's also traveling in the story.
Exactly. I was just going to say that it's most appropriate to read a book like this, which is about travelers and traveling and movement and shifting perspectives while you're doing the same, while you're making your own journey.
True.
I'm really
so yeah. And I also read it across time. I took many months. I went slow because I was like, I'm going to take my time. And I loved the prose. It's so beautiful.
Thank you. That makes me so, so happy. I can't tell you because, that's what you hope. That's what that's what your book does to a reader, that they savor it, that they want to spend time with it, and that they appreciate, your language, your craft. And this is such a dream. This is such a joy. Thank you, Alpha.
Thank you for writing the book. It was like, I like to dog ear the book pages. I don't know. I'm like, some people say readers who dog ear books are monsters, and I have all dog ears. I like it, actually.
Hey, it's your copy. You can do whatever you want with it.
True that. I also love writing on the margins. I think that's the way I show love to a book that I really like. And yours is all dog-eared, as you can see. It's
so honored.
Pages after pages.
I'm so honored because this is like you having a conversation with the book, right? To dog-ear it, to scribble in the margins, and to engage with the text at that kind of intimate level. I love it.
Yeah. Can you tell us something about the book? Like, I know what this book is all about, but if you had to describe it in your words, what
Yeah.
is everything the light touches
Ooh,
for you as a story, as a novel? Might
it
be a difficult question.
I was just going to say, it sounds like the simplest question, right? That an author, ought to be able to tell you in the most pithy, succinct way what their book is about. But to be very honest, even though the book has been out a couple of years now, I still struggle with this question because I feel like this book is
Mm,
about everything. It's about our
mm,
relationship to the world, to each other, our relationship to language, our relationship to how we understand everything, um, which makes it a book about epistemology at one level, right? How do we know what we know? How do we learn what we learn about the world, about the living world, about each other, about ourselves? Do we learn through categories? Do we learn by
mm,
splitting hairs? Do we learn by division and segregation? Or do we learn through wholeness? Do we learn through unity and connection and relationship? And this is what the book tussles with. At the heart of it, it is a tussle between these two different ways of seeing and learning and being in the world. And it throws that question to the reader, or at least I hope it does. What kind of person are you? Do you seek to divide? Do you seek to unify? Um,
mm. True.
yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a wonderful way. And the book has the title has everything in it, and everything the light touches is basically like everything. I think that
hmm.
makes perfect sense with the title. Like it connects
Thank
with it.
you. Thank you. Thank you for saying that. And thank you for getting it because it was such an ambitious attempt for me. Um, I'd never written or attempted anything like this before. So, to hear you appreciate that means a lot to me.
Where did the idea for the book come? Like, I think like that's
Yeah,
something that we'd all like to know. Like,
yeah.
was it the nature? There's so much nature in the book. So was it nature that led you to the characters, or was it the characters that led you to nature, or maybe there was some other way that the book came about?
Yeah. Yeah. I like to think of this answer as one that encompasses the kind of long perspective that the book also offers you. That
Mhm.
this book, in some ways, began long, long before I even started writing it. And perhaps this book began long, long before my own story began, before I was born. I feel as though in writing this book, I tapped into a story that had begun when the universe did, and that continues to this day. And that might be a poetic answer, but I know it's not a very helpful one. So I'm going to try and share with you the moment that, in some ways, served as the catalyst for the book, right? And that happened to be a time when I was in the UK. I was in London. I was a student, and it was about a decade ago, I think now. Time. What does time mean?
Wow. So the idea started a decade ago?
Yes. Oh my God. It's an idea that came to me so, so long ago. But yes, I was in a little garden somewhere outside London. And in this garden, there was this exhibition that was happening in some little corner. And it was an exhibition about women botanists from
Mm-hmm.
England during the Victorian, Edwardian ages. So I stood there
Mm.
on this rather beautiful morning, in the sunshine on my own, reading about the lives of these women. And they did lead the most unruly lives. They did
Mm.
a lot of things that they weren't supposed to do at the time. They traveled on their own. They collected plants. They wanted to be scientists. They were artists. They drew botanical drawings. So they led these very, um, you know, unruly lives. And I was so
Mm.
inspired by these stories. And at that moment, like a little seed of an idea was planted in my head. I had this image of a young woman botanist, a young Edwardian woman botanist traveling from London
Mm.
to India and perhaps even closer home to Northeast India, where I'm from. And there she was, traveling across the seas on this epic adventure.
Mm.
And of course, as you know, in the book, this character becomes Evelyn, becomes Evie.
Evie, yeah.
But at that point, I asked myself, why is she traveling? What is she looking
Mm.
for? What quest is she on? And I think I had to write the book to find out.
Yeah,
So
because yeah,
tell me.
that's what Evie says. Sometimes you only know what you're looking for after you found it,
Yes.
which is like such a beautiful way to look at life, especially now when we are so focused on goals and like there's so much pressure on time and we
Yes.
just forget the magic that is
I
around us.
know, and we have to be so goal driven in everything that we do and in everything that we imagine that sometimes we forget just the sheer joy and beauty of being on a journey. So that's the spirit with which the book began, the spirit of inquiry, of curiosity, of adventure, of
Mm.
wanting to know more.
Wow. So it began like women botanists. So there was
Yes.
a character and there was also nature. So it came together.
Came together so easily in some ways. And after that, I because I was asking myself this question, what is she doing? What is she looking for? Um, and it so happens in life that you have these conversations that just inspire you out of the blue. And I remember I was chatting with a friend who happened to be studying in this very small but very important little alternative educational institute, which is called the Schumacher College. And he was telling me that we're studying Goethean science, and I asked him, much as Evie does in the book, what is Goethean science? And he said, well, I can share with you what I know, and here are some books that you can read. And that's how Goethe was pulled into the story, was harnessed into the story, because the more that I
Oh.
about Goethean science, the more I imagined Evie as someone who would have also read him and been inspired by his scientific consciousness. So Goethe appears in the book almost as like a domino effect, one after another. And if I pulled Goethe into the book, it felt rather strange and rather incomplete to not have Linnaeus in the book, because Linnaeus is the character, is the central protagonist around whom all of the other characters offer resistance.
Yeah.
I thought if I didn't have Linnaeus in the book, it would make for a very one-sided argument. And one-sided arguments are not very convincing to anyone. So Linnaeus is there as the spine, the stem. If you see structurally, he appears in the middle of the book, quite naturally. So he offers us the spine, the stem of the book, around which all of these other characters appear. Shai, who is the character whose story cradles all of the other stories, came to me last. And
Oh.
she came to me because at some point I had this idea that Burtian science is so interestingly and so unexpectedly close to indigenous science.
Mm.
Shai offers us this space to connect the two because she, as you know, returns home to the northeast of the country of India, and she spends time with a community in the countryside, in rural Meghalaya, with an indigenous community who have a very different way of being the natural world. And I thought, this is an incredible connection to make, but one that, of course, I don't want to explicitly spell out in the book. So these stories sit gently entangled and yet slightly apart, structurally and thematically as well, but they speak to each other. They talk to each other. They echo each other in this.
Something that I loved about the characters is how they are spread across time, continent, country, culture, language, and yet they are together, in your book, and they appear as like separate chapters. Um, Before we move to Goethe, let me talk about Linnaeus, who appears like we don't see him as a character, but we get to see him through his diaries. So I'm curious, like why, when there are other characters that appear as characters, but he appears as, we don't see him, we just see his diaries, and we see him through other characters.
We do. That's such a good question. Linnaeus is in some ways, or is in a lot of ways, the character or the persona who is most distant to me in terms of time, geography, and culture, of course, but also in terms of ideology. You may have guessed by now that I'm not quite the Linnaean. I'm more the Goethe.
Yeah.
I prefer to be in the world in a space of connectivity and relationship rather than division and segregation. So it was difficult for me to write Linnaeus because I was already quite prejudiced against him. I have to admit, I thought, oh my God, this is a character that I don't agree with, morally, ethically, I really don't. So how am I going to write him? So I started by spending time with his texts. And if by any chance you pick up a text by Linnaeus, Philosophia Botanica or Systema Natura, which are all texts about the natural world, you'll see that he was an obsessive list maker.
Yeah, and his diary, some of the diary entries that you write are like in the form of list.
Exactly. And he obsessively made lists and he obsessively wrote in this way about the living world. Now, the interesting thing about lists is that when you look at them on a page, they appear very, very close to poetry in terms of format, in terms of sometimes even the way that lists are written. They can appear very poetic. And I thought, okay, I've been struggling, to write Linnaeus because I'm not quite sure what to do with him. But what if I allow myself an entry point that is a little different to the others, that offers me a chance to do something different with his story? What if I work with poetry? What if I work with, more specifically, erasure poetry? And erasure poetry, you might already be familiar with, is a form of poetry, is a technique that works with a pre-existing text. So I took Linnaeus's travel diaries and turned his travel diaries into poetry. But poetry that is born of negotiation between him and me, between my struggle with his ideas and his struggle to be in my poems. It was a dance, it was a negotiation, it was an argument. And what emerges on the page is something new, but something new that is always haunted by the old, by the previous, right? Because what I employed through erasure was to take his words, his lines, and to kind of make them my own, but also still keep his idea, his vision, his imagery going. So it was a dance, but it was a very tricky dance. And this is why you have at the heart of the book, at the center of the book, a narrative which is lyric in nature, which is poetic. It's poetry, because it allows us also in some ways to directly hear his voice, because a lot of these poems, if not most of them, are instruction poems. They tell you what to do, and if you read his diary text, believe me, Alpha, you will realize that Linnaeus was somebody who liked telling you what to do and what to think, and he was quite the he was a man of very he was a man of certainty.
He likes,
world. Well, I know it. So this is why he appears in this way, in this manner in the book, whereas all of the others, Goethe, Shai, Evie, occupy this almost more fluid space of prose, which is quite startling, because you often think of fluidity in terms of something more poetic and poetry. But in the book, I found that this was subverted in some ways.
I think what the diary did for me was also humanized him. Like you mentioned, you didn't like that character a lot, and then you felt biased. I think bringing it as a diary also lets us see it in a very intimate way. Like we get to see his mind.
Absolutely. And to be very honest, I can confess this now. By the end of it, after spending time with Linnaeus, I realized, you know what? God damn it. No matter how much I try and dislike him entirely, it wasn't possible, because there was something that I shared with him. And what I shared with him was this deep and infinite love for the natural world. And I couldn't bring myself to hate him entirely because of that. He expressed such wonder about the world. And I thought, you know what? I was in danger of behaving in a very Linnaean manner by placing him in a little box. But even Linnaeus himself is unboxable.
Oh, so yeah. Even he's like a leaf, he's also branching out, and even though he likes to organize things, like the book blurb at the back of the book says this about Linnaeus: God creates, Linnaeus organizes. Even then you couldn't organize him in a box.
I tried, and I could not. I realized that actually everyone is uncategorizable, even Linnaeus himself.
Wow. That's so fascinating to hear about Linnaeus, and how sometimes we might be biased to a character, but then we might come to like them eventually after writing them. I think that's something that writing does.
I think like them for sure, but also more interestingly for me, it complicates them. And that's what we want to write. We want to write complicated characters. We want to say, people are complicated. They are made up of multitudes. They are contradictory. mystery, and it's impossible to pinpoint, who someone is exactly, because that point constantly shifts.
Yeah. It's never black and white. There's a lot of other colors
Other colors, many,
are
many.
showing up. True. And that's also what light is. It has all colors combined in it. And we just can't see it with our eyes, but it's there.
We know it's there. Exactly.
After talking about Linnaeus, it's like impossible not to talk about Goethe. I loved this character, and that was my favorite part in the book. I was like, oh my god, I want to read books that he's written, but then I was also a bit scared. I was like, what if I don't like the real Goethe?
But if I may ask, what did you enjoy about Goethe? I'd love to know.
I think I love the journey that he goes from, the whole thing, and I also love the prose. I think I get to see him as a person, and it just feels like I'm there with him when he goes to Rome, and then you feel that, and then he gets disappointed, right, when he goes to Rome, and he's like, oh yeah, this is the place you have to be, but then he realizes he's there, and he's like, oh, I don't know, you feel that along with him, and that human, I just loved him as a character. I was like, I just wanted to read and read and read, and I didn't want it to end. And then there were just 2 chapters. So yeah, please write more, or maybe a spin-off.
Spin-off.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. It was very, very intimidating to write Goethe. It's okay for me to share that with you, because he's Goethe,
Yeah, he's a big name in the world.
Yes, and a white male European with this legacy that looms over and around him, through the centuries, a literary legacy that is, so so much larger now than possibly it ever was, or it keeps increasingly getting larger and larger. So it was very intimidating to write Goethe, even though it was easy to, or wasn't difficult, shall I say, to obtain literature about him, because so much has been written about him, and there are his diaries and letters and his own texts and a gazillion books that have been written about him. So he was very accessible in that way. But just the thought of writing him into the novel was terrifying, especially because we are who we are, right? We are women writers from some little corner of the brown world, and we are told these narratives, and we tell ourselves these narratives eventually of who are we to write them. Do we have a right to do this? Because we feel like so few stories belong to us. And been told through the ages, through colonialism, through patriarchy, that we are only really ever allowed to speak about certain things or write about certain things. And we don't have that kind of, embracive, entitled, even access to the world. So him was terrifying. But what helped eventually was finding other books that incorporated Goethe as a literary character, and in turn also humanized him, and perhaps even sometimes made a little fun of him and mocked him a bit and had a little of I thought, oh, actually, this is what I need to remember, that as you just mentioned, that he's human and he's flawed.
Yeah.
He's contradictory, and he's the realization that I eventually came to, that he was flawed and human and susceptible to, all the things that we are susceptible to. And of course, there is an immense amount of privilege to contend with, being who he was, but he was also in some other ways exceedingly vulnerable and, and misunderstood. And we all know that feels like, you know. So by the end of it, that's what I tried to harness, as human rather than this legendary sort of literary figure.
I was just trying to find that scene where he falls in love with a lady that he meets, and then he figures out it'll be a bit of a spoiler for our listeners that she's going to be married. And then let me just read this. It just feels so human because then this is like short conversation that they have. She asks, "Will we not have another lesson?" She asks him, her eyes wide in disappointment. "Perhaps later," he says. And in his mind, he's saying, "in another lifetime." And it just feels so I think that's how we feel, right? Like, it's so wonderful to hear that internal thought.
Yeah, that it will never happen,
Yeah. And I think that's how people feel. That's how, when we get rejected by people we think we might like.
Exactly. It was really important because, Goethe was also a serial, what is the word? He serially kept falling in love as well, in life. And I thought it was so important to bring in a scene like that where, he's utterly infatuated with her and he faces rejection. I mean, what humanizes us more than rejection, right?
Yeah, true. I just, there are these small moments in the book that I just feel like it just takes me closer to the character. And there's one with Evie and, oh no, I forgot the name of the character, Mr.
So do I. So have I. But the plant collector.
Yes, the plant collector. And then they have this, they're in a ball and in India, they've arrived in India, and then they're just having these, they're in a place. They don't want to be in the ball, obviously. They don't want to be there. They just want to go out there in the world and collect plants. And then they have the short interaction, which is so lovely. I mean, it just, it was really beautiful.
Thank you. It's that moment where they find each other and they find a space of understanding and a space of just relatedness, that they share the same spirit underneath it all. And thank you for bringing that up, because I loved writing that scene.
It felt like watching a movie in so many ways. Like, these are Victorian movies, like maybe Jane Austen, or, like seeing that in life. It was so lovely. And I knew they were gone. Like, these characters would come to an end. They won't go forever. So how do you write endings for each of your stories? Like, each of these characters have an end.
Yeah.
And also the book as a whole also has an end. So how do you know it's going to end? Like, do you know this is where you want to take them, or does it emerge over time? And even if it emerges over time, how do you decide, because it can go on forever?
It's true. It's true. What a lovely question. Thank you for asking that. Because as you've so rightfully pinpointed, stories are never ending. Stories, in fact, have no beginning and no end. We decide where to pick up on an opening, and we decide where to bring things to a close. But, if you think about it, those stories actually go on, and they've begun long before you begin them. These are such incredibly important craft decisions, which is why I appreciate this question even more because they are so rare. The craft questions, I mean. So thank you really for asking this. I think for this book in particular, what gave me a sense of a structure for each of the narratives, and there are 4 to contend with, so that already makes things complicated. You're not working with one or a couple timelines, you're working with a quartet of timelines. But what helped give me some sense of structure was that I knew that these were journeys. And at some point, I realized that I wanted to start each story at the beginning of a journey. So each of them begin at the point of departure. For Shai, airport, for Evie at the London docks, for Goethe in Carlsbad, where he leaps into a carriage in the middle of the night, and for Linnaeus on foot, walking out of right? So I had that sense of a structure, of a journey. And some of these stories, a couple, Linnaeus and Goethe, for example, come to a close when that particular journey comes to a close. So for Linnaeus, when he decides, he's ready to go home, he's ready to be back home in Uppsala, and the verse, the narrative turns towards home. For Goethe, it's at the end of his glorious time in Rome. That moment of departure from the place where you have longed to be, the place where you have longed to arrive at. It closes at the point of departure from a place where he has always longed to be in. With Evie and Shai, it was much more tricky. With Evie in particular, you can read Evie as a very archetypal quest narrative. And the archetypal quest narrative usually has this particular protagonist who is setting out on a journey in search of something, right? A magic sword, or, their long lost mother, or, something that they are seeking. And Evie is on a similar quest. Now, a lot of archetypal quest journeys end with the protagonist actually finding what they are looking for. Then the story kind of coming to that traditional close of everyone having changed, right? The protagonist is changed because they have been on that journey and they have found what they're looking for, and they realize sometimes that what they've been looking for is something that they've always had within them. That kind of traditional storyline. But I wanted to play with Evie's narrative a little bit by sending you on a very traditional quest narrative, but also withholding and constraining and withholding that achievement, because it's a very I think almost overdone narrative in some ways, right? Where the heroine achieves what they set out to achieve in some unexpected way. I wanted to withhold that. I wanted to do something unexpected, but something that was hopefully meaningfully unexpected. That actually what you're looking for sometimes is not the point at all. The point, what do you do when you are faced with certain choices?
Mm.
And that's where we leave Evie. We don't quite know what choice she
Yeah.
makes, but it is a moment of anti-narrative in some ways. It is a story that has led you down a certain path, but it is not. I refuse, and the story refuses to give you that traditional, neat, wrapped up in a bow kind of ending.
Yeah, it's very true.
It instead allows you or offers you and sometimes nudges you into a space of reflection. What would she do? But in that question also lies the other question of what would I do? Right?
Yeah.
That's what I hope the reader comes to at the end of Evie's story. With Shy, I mean, this is what makes, this is what makes your question such a great question, because I struggled with the ending of Shy because it wasn't just the ending of or the closing of Shy's story, it was the closing of the book.
Yeah, that's the last chapter.
Yes, and how on earth do you inhabit both those spaces in those last few pages? And it took me so long to come to that landing, to that space of closure, because it had to feel like an appropriate closing for Shy, because we must respect that it is her story first and foremost. But it also has to feel in some ways expansive enough, almost like a coda to a song. It has to feel expansive enough to hold the book, to say, I acknowledge that this is the closing for all of your stories.
True. Wow. Like, I struggle creating one character, and then you have like 4 different across time and continent and culture. You are the ending after Shy's ending. We have like a poem, or it could also be a song. Then there is also a beginning. There's a separate page that's not like attached in the book, but it comes with the book.
Because my publisher forgot to actually include it in the manuscript for the paperback edition, but it is very much a part of the book.
Okay. So this is the opening, the one with this. This is a fern leaf.
Yes.
I see. So it opens like this, and then it ends with like a poem or a song.
Yes, I love those words that you've used, and one that I would also add to the mix is an invocation. It is an invocation and a call to action in some ways, and it is also very, very intentionally a voice of community, a voice of us, of we. It speaks in the collective, it speaks in the plural, because these are the voices, the songs, the poems of the people. And it very much, at least I hope it does, it's very much meant to function like a collective communal voice that opens the book and a collective communal voice that closes the book. Because in the end, at the end of all things, that is where our hope and our strength lies. In the we, in connection, in relationship, in us listening to each other's stories and making space for those stories to be told.
Wow, absolutely. Your book is also, the dedication in your book is also for those who told me stories. So it opens, like that's like the first page after the title page and all the information about like the copyrights and all. So I think, it's such a it made me think about stories, and there are stories inside stories, especially in the Shillong stories and in the rural village. There are songs, and then there are myths. So there's like it's like a web. It just keeps on and on and on, and it's so beautiful. Instead of getting entangled, I feel like it just enriches the book and the story. And something else that really struck me in the book was the use of language. And when I say language, I mean there are like a couple of languages going on. There's English and there's Khasi and there's also other local dialects. And I was curious to know, when did you decide to use like there are some dialogues that are in English, some dialogues that are in Khasi, and some in other dialects. And I was curious, when did you decide to use which one?
Yeah. That's again such a good question. And I'm very aware as a writer that very aware as a writer who comes from a very particular part of the world, from a very particular region, that I write in English. Because that is not a simple statement, as we know. It is a statement that emerges from a very complicated colonial context, from a very complicated context that involves, the coming of Christianity and Christian missionaries to the hills that I call home. So I'm aware of how the past has shaped and in so many ways also eroded the languages of where I come from, where our linguistic abilities now for so many of us lie in the singular, in English. So as much as I can, and this is, I think, something that also occurs in my very first book, which was a book of short stories called Boats on Land, which actually Everything the Light Touches is quite an interesting sort of companion piece to, because Everything the Light Touches returns thematically and geographically to to the spaces of Boats on Land. So this is something that occurs even in Boats on Land. I try very much to be as polyphonic as a writer as I can be, in terms of musicality, in terms of language itself. And I say musicality with great deliberation because Khasi, which is the language that is largely in these hills, Khasi was always an oral language, in that we didn't need a script. We had songs and poems and stories that formed, the reservoir of knowledge and history and identity for our people. So these are the kind of roots that I try and go back to as someone who has been educated in a certain way in a convent school, I've received a particular very Anglophile university education. So I say this with a longing and an attempt to return to a language that has so largely been lost to me. And when Khasi lies on the page with English in my books, it does so with a great political intent to say these languages, at least on the page, are equal. They lie in equal importance, in equal validity on the page, even if in my own life that is not the case. Because I speak in English, I write in English, I probably dream in English. And Khasi lies very much only at the very edges of my tongue. But in my book, it is so, or in my books, because as I said, this also happens in Boats on Land. It's so important for me to bring in that context in the best way that I can, to bring in that sense of the local, of where I'm from, the language that, that exists here because of the way that our landscape looks like. I think there's a section at the very end of the book where Shai speaks of learning or relearning Khasi. And she says, I'm beginning to understand place and language because I see that link, that the landscape has shaped the language that we speak. And so it's my attempt to bring all of this into my books as much as I can, also into my life. So it happens, I'd like to hope, in a way that is natural also to me, that there are some words that cannot be translated and should not be translated, and I want them to lie in their most authentic form on the page. And that is when Khasi comes in. And you will never find a glossary of footnotes in my books because, you know what? It doesn't matter. What matters is that these languages occupy the same space.
True. And it doesn't take away, even though I don't understand what they're saying. I also understand what they're saying. It's like it doesn't take away. It's not a blank slate. It's not like a vacant thing that you can't understand. I think I can kind of guess, oh, maybe this character means this because there's context, there's a lot of things happening, and it meshes in very well, I think. When I was reading it, it flows from one language to another, because something I struggle with, because I also come from a place where we have so many different languages, and bringing them together on page is such a challenge, because each language, like you said, has its own musicality, has its own thing going on, and sometimes they're like instruments that are different from each other and they don't come together. Or maybe I haven't found the techniques yet to bring them together in a way that they resonate with each other, or they sound unified. So maybe there's some.
But also sometimes I think they don't need to sound unified, because I think as readers, and I love what you said about how you aren't intimidated by this or put off by this, by the presence of words that are not English on the page, because as you said, you may not understand them perfectly, but there is an intuition with which with which you proceed. And I think that is so important for us as readers, but also as human beings, that we may not understand everything about another community. We may not ever be fully a part of, another culture, but we can appreciate and we can acknowledge and we can respect that, yes, there are differences and there is nothing wrong with differences. In fact, they ought to just be dealt with intuitively and generously and receptively, rather than, with dismissal or fear or anxiety. So maybe there's also space for that, Alpha, that it's okay for things to sometimes be disjunctured, be brought together in that way, because it is in life, and not everything has to be, beautifully sort of put together, and some things are just unwieldy, and that's okay.
True. It doesn't require harmony all the time. Sometimes they can just be the way they are, and that's all right. And there's perhaps beauty in that too. Yeah, that's so wow. That's a lovely way to look at it. And yeah, that's true. Do you think it's a good time to do a reading? Would you like to read something?
Oh my God. Okay, I was going to ask you at the beginning of this conversation, but I forgot what you might like me to read. Is there anything in particular that you would, you know, like me to read to you?
Mm, wow, the whole book.
We'll be
Yeah.
logging in on Zoom many times.
Yeah, over months. um, anything you'd like? I mean, yeah, I mean, I love the part with Goethe. I don't know. I'm so biased. But anything you like. I mean,
Let me see. Let me see. I thought that I would actually just read the beginning of the Goethe narrative, since he's
okay.
also your favorite character. Maybe we begin where his story begins in the book. Yeah.
Yeah.
On the morning of September 3rd, 1786, so early the mist hasn't lifted off the topel, and the sky shows no tender glimpse of dawn. A figure steps out of the Three Moors Hotel. He is alone, unencumbered by little more than a portmanteau and a knapsack. He walks quickly through the empty market square and then hurries down a side street, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. He doesn't look back once, and not until he reaches the post house does he stop, place his portmanteau beside him, and adjust the knapsack slung across his back. At this hour, in the small town of Carlsbad, he is the only one there waiting. His presence goes unmarked by the slumbering inhabitants behind their shuttered windows. Around him are empty balconies, darkened buildings, and beyond them a river unseen. It already feels like winter. And if the inclemency of the past few weeks, months even, is anything to go by, tomorrow too it will rain. From somewhere a breeze lifts, rushes past him coldly, and vanishes. In a few minutes, a post chaise draws up in a great and noisy clatter. The man climbs in, joining three other drowsy passengers, pays his fare, and when asked what name he is known by, answers gruffly, Mola, Johann Philipp Mola. The driver inquires because it is needed for the records, but he casts a second glance at him, noticing the passenger's soft, cloud grey travelling coat with its long shoulder cape topped by a warm velvet collar. Not many of his kind grace this humble coach. Strange too that he is alone, without any servants and with so little luggage. Well, never mind all that. None of his business. He makes to shut the door when the traveller speaks. How long to Agra? 9 hours at most. At that he sits back, seemingly satisfied. We're ready to leave, sir. Yes, the traveller repeats. We're ready to leave. The chaise makes its swift way southwest in the darkness along the fringes of Kaiserwald, the forest looming beside them, prehistoric and immense. By 8:30, they arrive at Zivoda, the day foggy but beautifully calm. The other passengers are awake now, two portly gentlemen, one with a flourishing moustache, and a young man apprenticed to a bookkeeper in Munich, talking about the weather, how they hope that after so wretched a summer, they should enjoy a fine, dry autumn. Look at the sky, exclaims the traveller in the grey coat. The upper clouds are streaky and fleecy, while the lower ones are heavy. He smiles. This appears to be a good sign, don't you think? The others, not wishing to admit how little to them this observation portends, amiably agree. Further on they travel, descending into the valley, the landscape now alight and green, undulating before their eyes. At noon they arrive at Agra, lying at the foot of the Fitkel Mountains under a warm and shining sun. Here they stop for lunch, and although the friendly gentlemen invite him to join them inside the rest house, the traveler declines and eats his midday meal alone beneath a bright sky. At 2, they continue southward. The passengers doze despite the rutted road, lulled by goulash and beer, though the man in the grey coat keeps his gaze vigilantly turned outside. He is drinking in the air, the scenery, as though seeing everything for the first and last time.
Yay! That's the beginning of Goethe's chapters, and I had no idea I would grow to like him so much as a character when I was reading the first few pages. He looked like this aloof gentleman in the first few paragraphs. He's like, oh, he doesn't care about anyone. But then as the story proceeds, we see him in so many lights, and there's so many dimensions to him, and that was just so wonderful and lovely.
Thank you. Thank you for staying with the book and with all of the characters. So patient.
I also read another of your book, The Nine-Chambered Heart.
Yes.
And
so different.
I know. Yeah, exactly. They're so different. But they do have something similar. They are all, like, the chapters are all characters. Which is also something that happens in Everything the Light Touches. I was wondering, how did that come, like your style of writing, especially with these two books, writing chapters as characters? It's a little different in, sorry.
Don't worry.
It's a little different in the Nine-Chambered Hearts, but it's still characters in chapters. So yeah, I'm curious, how did that emerge in your writing?
That's such an interesting thing to pick up on, because it's not something that I actually thought of in this clarified way. I think for me, in both the books, character is story. It really is as simple as that. The characters make up the story. The characters unfurl or unveil the story. So they are portals to this world. They are portals to a way of seeing and being, of course. But they are also portals to perspectives, various points of view. I mean, this is why we talk about point of view as a craft element, because each character offers us a story which is consequently a point of view. Every story is trying to get us to believe in something, to think about something, to see something differently. And hence every character then is doing the same, right? So with characters in Everything the Light Touches, of course, you stay with them, given the scope of the book and what it's trying to do, you stay with them for a much longer time, or at least you stay with them through the length of a particularly transformative journey. So even if the journey is a few months, or in Goethe's case, a few years, it doesn't really matter how long the journey is, but it is a particularly transformative one. And so you stay with them. With the Nine-Chambered Heart, these are much, much shorter chapters, and I mean that quite literally in terms of length. So I remember when I was writing Nine-Chambered Heart, and the writing process for Nine-Chambered Heart was very, very different to Everything the Light Touches. The Nine-Chambered Heart is a much more, shall we say, inward book, in that it plumbs not the libraries of the external world in that way, but the resources of your emotional landscape. It's a much more internal book in that way. So I wrote it very differently to Everything the Light Touches. And I remember giving myself a word count restraint for every chapter. I wanted to write each of the chapters within 4,000 words. That was the constriction that I gave myself. And I did this because I wanted each voice or each character to have exactly the same amount of space to tell their story. And I was interested in seeing how each character would use that space. And I think each character uses that space quite differently. Again, like with Everything the Light Touches, the timeline of each of the chapters of Nine Chambered Heart are different. Some are a day or two, some are a week, some are a lifetime, some are, years, months. But how do you compress or expand all of that into this vessel, this 4,000 word vessel? So you are traveling with these characters, but in a very, very different way. You are traveling through a moment in their life that is not perhaps a journey like it is with Everything the Light Touches, but it is a particularly transformative moment in their life, usually because they are in some way negotiating or interacting or in some kind of relationship with the central character who is never really she's present, but she's also very absent in the book. So each of these characters then becomes a voice that also reveals not just themselves to us, but also reveals this particular character, this central, protagonist, this woman, to us. I think this happens with both the books, and you're so perceptive to have seen this because, as I said, I'm interested in how story and character are linked. But also I'm beyond that interested in how character is perspective, and how each character gives us a different perspective. In Everything the Light Touches, gives us a different perspective on how to see the world, how to see the living world, how to see nature, botany, science, how to see ourselves. And in the Nine Chambered Heart, each voice, each character gives us a different perspective or a different way to see this one particular character at the heart of the book, this unknown, unnamed, perhaps even unknowable woman. Yeah.
I think giving each character 4,000 words to tell the story is such a fantastic exercise. It's like, yeah, you just have this much space. What are you going to tell? I think it just brings out what is essential for this character.
Exactly.
Like the heart of who they are.
Exactly.
I would love to try that. That sounds so much fun.
Please feel free to exactly this. It was exactly that. It was such an interesting exercise for me as a writer and a storyteller to give myself this constraint. I know that there is great, there is great, what is the word? Freedom in not having any of these constraints, in writing a book, a chapter as long as you think it needs to be, and sort of embracing that, that massive landscape, which kind of happens in Everything the Light Touches. But I also really enjoy these little rules that I give myself. It's like, would you really enjoy playing tennis if there were no lines on the court? If there was no net? would it be tennis if there was,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? So what
Yeah.
really brings out somebody's skill, somebody's story? Um, Perhaps it's having these little constraints, you know?
Mm. Wow. One last question before we move to the rapid fire round.
Oh my
And
God.
um, please don't stress out. um, because we're talking about the Nine Chambered Heart and also Everything the Light Touches. Like you said, these two books are so different. They're so vast. Everything the Light Touches is so vast as compared to the Nine Chambered Hearts. And I wanted to know, what was your process of growth as a writer, moving from one book to another? Because for me, as a writer myself, like writing one book feels like climbing a mountain. It feels so difficult and impossible sometimes. But you've moved from one to another, which is so fantastic. And like, I know it's a long question and it could take another hour to just dive
Probably
into that,
will.
but yeah, and we'll just have to keep reconnecting with our free
Forever
Zoom
and ever.
and briefly, if you had to say,
Yeah.
what was your
Yeah.
growth process as a writer, going from one book to another?
Yeah. That's, again, such a perceptive question. So, thank you so much. I think it's only now, in some ways, that I can, as they say, look back and narrativize the process in some way, because when you're in it and you're doing it and you're kind of in the space of movement and transformation and change, I think it's very hard to articulate and to actually even sometimes understand what is going on. But when I, look back now and think about how I was writing the Nine Chambered Heart and how I came to write Everything the Light Touches, I can see that you're always writing a book in order to be able to write the next one. That you're always building, building a certain kind of stamina, a certain kind of skill with the book that you're writing in order to be able to do the next one. And perhaps even the one after that. So, what Nine Chambered Heart gave me was the ability, very important, I think, for a writer. It gave me the ability to think about certain things that are looked at very singularly in a way that allowed for multiplicity, that allowed for a multitude of perspectives. For example, this one particular character at the heart of Nine Chambered Heart, the woman, who is unveiled to us and revealed to us through so many different perspectives and through so many different stories, right? Through all of these voices. She is revealed as multifaceted, and as also different to each of the voices who speak about her. Sometimes I think what happens, and this happens a lot, we are gripped by a certain kind of singular reality. We think that this is the only way to see something. This is the only way to see someone. This is the only way to look at a particular issue, right? There's no other way. And I think we get locked in that way of seeing. We are gripped by a particular version of reality. The Nine Chambered Heart really allowed me to unlock that within myself, perhaps, and also with the characters in the book, to say this one person is a multitude of people, and this the traits that she displays are looked at differently by different people. They're interpreted differently by different people. So there are many stories that exist about her because we exist in that kind of multitude. And it was an exercise also in some way to understand how we build stories about each other and about ourselves. Sometimes we are told a very particular story about ourselves that we begin to believe for the rest of our lives. Perhaps that story is not quite true. And perhaps someone else comes along and says, no, but I don't think of you in that way. I actually think, you do this because of this. Only something unlocks and you say, I never imagined that, but that could be as true and as valid as something else, right? So I think this ability to unlock the grip that one singular reality can have on you allows for, at least for me, it allows for a richer space of storytelling, to acknowledge this kind of complexity and this kind of this bundle, that the fact that we exist as these bundles of contradictions, and this helped pave the way for a very different kind of book, but which at heart kind of deals with the same thing of saying that we cannot place people and the world and everything in it into these little boxes, because that is a very singular way of looking at things. That everything actually exists in this glorious, messy multitude. And here is a story that really tries to dive very deeply into exploring that idea. So that for me is the growth, I would like to call it, that happened between these two books, but also it's a growth that links these two books very, very deeply. Even they can very easily and and understandably be seen as very different, books by themselves.
Wow. I just loved what you said, that the book that you're writing is actually opening doors to write the next book, which is like a very expansive way to look at a set of skills or something and not be bound by it, because sometimes we can be bound by like writing a book can be a goal, and then maybe perhaps if things work out, people achieve it, and then maybe they get bound by it. But I love the idea that you were just preparing yourself for the future. There's always something to look forward to ahead. And there are so many stories to tell, obviously. So, it can go on forever like stories.
Exactly. We're constantly building that stamina,
Yeah. And on that note, shall we move to the rapid fire?
Hey, I'm ready.
You're ready. Yes, you can do it. Don't worry. It's not going to be that hard. Do you have a favorite character from Everything the Light Touches that you would like to meet in real life?
Oh my God. I think I share my answer with you. It would have to be Goethe. But this is because he's asking me today. And I've just read an excerpt from his story. So I'm feeling particularly close to him. If you ask me next week, maybe it'll be Shai. But for now, it's
Okay, yes. For now, we lock that answer, and you can always change it. Do you like writing with the background music?
Oh my God, no. I need silence because I cannot think and hear the musicality of my own words. So when I'm writing, I'm actually listening to language.
Oh, wow. Do you read out loud as well when you do that?
always, because I need to learn how the lines fall not just on the page, but on my ear.
Mm, lovely. Do you have a favorite place to write?
Um, I used to, because that's when I would come home. I had a particular spot where I would write by the window, and I loved it. But things are being shifted around, so I might have a new favorite writing spot for you in like 2 weeks' time.
Oh, yay! Great. Did you type everything the light touches, or did you write some parts of it, or was it mixed? How did that work?
It's usually mixed in that I make notes by hand, I write character sketches by hand. So there are certain things that I enjoy doing in a notebook. But the actual blood and bones of it, the writing of it happens on a computer simply for one reason, or mostly for one reason: cut and paste. Helps me rearrange things and restructure things in a way that I find just a little bit too time consuming in a sort of, a notebook.
Notebook, yeah. We have a little bit of a lineage there in organizing and writing. If you had to recommend 3 books, what would those books be right now? Like in this moment?
Absolutely. I would recommend Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Kimmerer. I would recommend Indica, A Deep Natural History of the Indian Subcontinent by Pranay Lal. And I would recommend Robert McFarlane's Underland, A Deep Time Journey. These come to me so easily because they are just the books that are closest to my heart.
Are these books related to your research process for Everything the Light Touches?
So much. No. They have such inspirations for Everything the Light Touches in so many different ways. And I'd like to think actually that they have, yes, helped me with the research for my book, but they have also been those kind of transformative texts that have changed me as a person, as a writer, beyond even this book.
I have a math question now. If you can recall and if you can share on record, how many times did you rewrite Everything the Light Touches?
Uncountable times, because I am a serial drafter and redrafter. So I will, write a first draft and then do a second draft and then do bits of the manuscript as a third draft and then other bits as a fourth. I can't count anymore. It just happens in this very complicated process of drafting and redrafting for at least a year or two, if not more.
So it's like happening at the same time. You're also writing new pieces. You're also reworking on the previous ones that you've already written.
Exactly.
Writing is rewriting, as they say. And I struggle with rewriting. I'm so lazy.
You need infinite patience, but you will be surprised by yourself one day, believe me.
Indeed. I hope to be surprised. What is it that you love most about writing?
What I love about writing, there's so many things, but what I love most about writing is that it allows me to learn so much about the world, but also about myself.
Yeah, it's outwards and inwards. It's magical. What advice would you give to writers who are just starting out, or who would like to produce something substantial like a book or a collection of short stories?
Um, one receives a lot of writing advice, but the one bit of writing advice that I found most useful is that no one else can tell your story. That you are so uniquely placed with the kind of experiences that you have and the kind of context that you come from, that no one else can ever tell your story in the way that you do.
Yeah, that's true. It's a fingerprint, isn't it? And it's unique.
Exactly.
You can't replicate it. Wow. I would love for this conversation to go on and on and on. And we've rejoined 3 times to keep this conversation going with the free Zoom subscription that we're surviving on.
We've made the most of it.
Yes, we've made the most of it. Thank you so much, Janice. It was so lovely to speak to you. And, it was so wonderful to read the book and to get to know about nature and people and characters, and to learn that the world is so complex and that we are also so complex as people, and to make peace with that in so many ways. I think sometimes I feel like, if things were simpler, it would be so easy. You don't have to worry so much. But I think the beauty comes in the complexities that are there around us. And I think a book shows that so in such a lovely manner.
Thank you so, so much. This has been such a joy and such a delight and so much fun. Thank you again for having me on your show. I've loved every minute of it.
Thank you so much for coming, and I hope to see you in person sometime soon.